pals, I'm here today with a slightly delayed April wrap up. I always think when I have a week off work, which I've just had, that I will get loads of videos filmed and get loads of books read, and the opposite always happens because I'm off work. So, I am off work, I don't know why I quoted that. So I think, well, I want to be off this work as well, because although this is a hobby, obviously it takes work to maintain the hobby. And then Johnny and I end up just playing more board games together and, you know, going out more and seeing family and stuff. So then I have less time to read than I would on a normal work week. So it's been really unproductive in terms of bookish stuff, both channel wise and reading. But I have played lots of board games and got really into a video game recently called Witchwood. So I mentioned a couple of years ago that I wanted to get into video games, and I got loads of amazing recommendations from you all and added them all to a Steam wish list and never really used it. And then recently we started replaying the original Spyro trilogy and enjoying it. And then the other day, Johnny just like clicked this game up and was like, oh, you might be interested in this. And I just started playing and haven't stopped. Absolutely love it. If you have played it, then I am now about to collect the 8th soul. So I guess I'm like 2/3 of the way through. There are 12 souls you collect. I love the vibe. I love the art. I love the music. I love the story. It is maybe a bit tedious when you have to keep going back and forth to get ingredients. But yeah, very much enjoying it. So if you know of any other video games that have a similar vibe, then do recommend them below. But I will be looking back through that big Steam list of loads of recommendations you all gave me a few years ago, but obviously that won't include any newer games. So anyway, this isn't a video gaming channel, this is a reading channel. And I read 7 books in the month of April, and a bit of a mixed bag. And I'm going to talk about the 2 books that I'm not really going to talk about here first, because one of them is Learning to Swim by Claire Chambers. That was my Patreon book club pick for March, and I gave it 2 stars overall. Didn't enjoy it very much, had lots of issues with the way the plot went, which I think was very much a reflection of when the book was published, which was 1999, I think. The sort of romance in it was very like old school, and I just wasn't on board with it. And so I did a spoiler review over on my Patreon for that. My Patreon is always linked down below. We have the first tier is I do a currently reading video once a month. The second tier is the book club. The third tier is every month I talk about all the books I DNF, which I always have lots of fun doing. And the fourth tier is I talk about all of the films and TV I watched. So if you're interested, it's linked down below. And it's not called subscribe. If you click support, then you'll get like all the previous videos in your tier. So that's always there. So I don't talk about those books here because I've already done a like 15-minute video talking about that book. And then the other book is Burnham Wood by Anna Catton. Definitely my favourite read of, do I keep saying March? Of April. And I really enjoyed it. It was a book that I was really enjoying when reading, and I gave it 4 stars. And then the more I've sort of sat with it since finishing it, the more I feel like it's more like a 4.5 stars. Like, I really enjoyed it. It's a book I'd happily sort of reread right now, even though I only read it a few weeks ago. And so I'm going to do a standalone review talking about it, because I've heard quite mixed reviews for it. And one of the things I've heard a lot of people say is that they found it quite slow to get started, and some of the middle section quite tedious. And I felt the opposite. I literally felt that maybe the first 3 pages were a bit of a slow introduction, but once I was on page 4, I was like hooked and I was compelled to keep reading. And yeah, I really enjoyed it and didn't find it slow at all. So I'm going to do a standalone review of that hopefully quite soon. So I read 5 other books. I have 2 of them in physical form here. So I'll chat about them first and then talk about the books I audioed or have returned to the library. The first one is The Other Side of the Bridge by Mary Lawson. So I read Mary Lawson's book Crow Lake towards the end of last year, also a Patreon book club read that a lot of us really enjoyed. I really loved it. It was a 5-star read for me. It was very much a like a solid book. It wasn't really doing anything new. What it was doing, I thought it was doing to perfection. So I wanted to carry on and read her books in publication order. The Other Side of the Bridge, is her second book, and this was published, let me check, in 2006. And sadly, I didn't enjoy this anywhere near as much as Crow Lake. You can 100% tell they're from the same author, but I think Crow Lake was just much more, I guess the characters were much more developed, the plot was much less predictable. The premise of this, I'm going to have to remind myself slightly, is that it opens with 2 brothers, one who is sort of very big and very good at the farm work. So his family have a farm in sort of rural Canada, and he's very sort of quiet and stoic. and his father really loves him, and then the other brother is very slight and very loud and sort of intellectual and witty, and the mother loves him. But that brother can also be quite cruel. There's this sort of tragic incident that happens between the brothers, and then you are also reading a section that is closer to the present day, although still I don't think set in the present, where a local boy who's around 16, 17, he's the son of the doctor, and he has started to work on the farm where the now adult sort of quieter brother works, and sort of stuff is revealed. So within the two storylines you start to find out what happened to pull the brothers apart and how that is going to affect the present day. Now, I think from pretty early on, and even like from the blurb, so I haven't really mentioned an element because I think it maybe gives a bit more away than you need, you sort of have a sense of what's going to happen. It feels inevitable. And as soon as you figure that out, you can sort of figure something out about the present day. And so the sort of big scene, this sort of climax towards the end of the book doesn't feel as epic as it probably should because, well, you sort of sussed it out quite early on. I think, again, she's a really solid writer. I think the perspective, the more contemporary perspective with the doctor's son was definitely stronger. I got a real sense of his character. I can picture all the landscapes and sort of buildings and interiors that she describes really well. But yeah, I just think maybe this plot felt a bit more run-of-the-mill, and in particular the storyline with the two brothers just felt quite frustrating. Like Arthur, who's the kinder brother, is the only person who really sees his brother Jake for who he is, and there's so many opportunities for him to sort of make his parents aware of how Jake isn't actually a very kind person and is hurting people in the community. And he doesn't, because he thinks it'll break his mother's heart. But it's quite frustrating to read that story and keep just being like, God, Arthur, just say something, and him not doing it. So this was like a 3-star read for me. I think I'll find it fairly forgettable. I'm definitely going to still carry on and read her later books, because I had a couple of comments from people who said they loved Crow Lake and didn't enjoy this one very much at all. So I know other people have then gone on to enjoy her later books. So I will carry on with that. The next book I read, I think this was the last book I read in the month, and The Other Side of the Bridge was probably the first book I read. So this is Leaving Atlanta by Tiara Jones. This is Tiara Jones' debut novel, but it's been out of print for quite a few years and it's just recently been republished. So I pre-ordered this edition because I've read her books in the reverse of publication order. So this is the last book of hers I've read, so I've now read all 4 of her books. I really enjoy her as an author, and yeah, this is a great debut novel. So this is almost like a retelling of a period in Tiara Jones' childhood, because I hadn't heard of this, but in 1982, in the summer in Atlanta, there was a serial killer who was killing young children, predominantly black boys, and Tiara Jones actually grew up during that period. And so this is a sort of imagining of that time period from, I think, 3 or 4 different children's perspectives. There is actually a child who's like someone in their classroom called Tiara Jones that the children reference, which I get why the author did that, but I think it does pull you out of the story somewhat when that character is mentioned, because you know it is this Tiara Jones, and then it reminds you that this is a novel that's being written, you know. But it's not a big enough thing to really detract from the book. I think Tiara Jones is an excellent writer. What I think she really excels at is, when I say a lot of authors make me able to sort of picture the scene, she not only does that, she makes me able to like feel the textures of the room and smell the room. And so she'll describe like the feeling of people's skin or the smell. She quite often describes how certain people smell. And that's something she does a lot in this book, because I think for children, smell can be a real comfort. If your mother always wears a particular body lotion or perfume, you will always remember that smell. And I think she captures that really well. I think she's very good at writing from a young child's perspective. I really felt like I completely believed these voices, and she gives these really distinct voices who pull this narrative together. This is obviously a sad story. Some of the children you're hearing about are disappearing and have likely been killed by this serial killer. I guess you could argue that this book isn't super plotty, because it almost feels like 4 long form short stories or short story novellas that all focus on this one event. The book sort of ends before the case is solved as we know it to be. So this isn't a book to pick up if you're really into plot. I think if you like reading stories about like a formative period in a childhood, then I'd give this one a go. But obviously just bear in mind that it is focused on quite a dark thing, and it's really interesting commentary. There's a lot of scenes where like the parents leave the news on when the children are having dinner, and the children are hearing things on the television they probably shouldn't be hearing. So there's a really interesting discussion of parents trying to sort of smother their children so that their children don't know about the danger, but at the same time needing their child to know about the danger because it's out there and it's very close. So yeah, would highly recommend this one. And then I read English Monsters by James Scudamore. I've since returned this one to the library, and this was a real mixed bag for me. So for the first maybe like 80 to 100 pages, I was thinking this has the ability to maybe be a 5-star read, because when this opens, we are being told about a young boy, his sort of childhood years, and he spends a lot of time with his grandparents in the rural English countryside because his father has some job that means that they live abroad quite often, and so they usually come back and stay with his grandparents for a few months. And he has this sort of idyllic upbringing with them. His grandparents are real characters, and just all the descriptions of their life together is joyous and wonderful and sort of achingly beautiful. So I really loved all those descriptions of the landscape and how his grandfather is a real part of the land, and the sort of respect that his grandfather and grandmother have for each other is lovely. But then you sort of know this from the blurb, that what happens is our narrator gets registered to go to an English boarding school because his parents want him to have sort of a British education, and so they go off to live wherever they live, and he goes to this boarding school, and actually this boarding school is pretty horrific. This book is set, I think, in the 80s, just before like violently, dealing with children was made illegal. I think at this point corporal punishment had been made illegal in day schools, but was still legal in boarding schools, I think. And so it's pretty horrific. Like, there are some like obviously trigger warnings for this book. There is like really extreme forms of both emotional, physical, sexual abuse, and just the terror, the pure terror these children live with is quite awful. So you get sort of a section where you deal with that, and for me that wasn't like quite as beautifully written, but it was still, well done, and it really gave you a sense of what this boarding school would feel like. Again, I could really picture everything. But then the narrative shifts again, and it's closer to the present day, and it is this boy as an adult and him sort of finding out something about his life at that boarding school, and sort of what they decide to do with that information. And that's where it really all falls apart for me, because in the present day narrative, a lot of the people he mixes with who went to this boarding school are from extreme privilege. They're really wealthy. The circles they move in are not the sort of people I like to read about. And so I don't usually read books from the male perspective. And yeah, the sort of combination of it being from a guy's perspective and also like really super wealthy men, I just didn't like any of these people. Didn't really, care for their present day. It was really interesting to see. This book is a really interesting discussion of trauma, and there is a large question mark. I don't really want to spoil anything about this plot, but there's a large question mark with our narrator as to what he truly experienced at the boarding school, because there is a feeling that he may have sort of hidden things from his own mind in order to survive it. So that's a sort of overarching question of the book, and also what it means to be a survivor of such horrific abuse, and if there's certain like right ways to be a survivor, and if some decisions you could make as a survivor are the wrong decisions, and sort of, I guess, whose right it is to comment on that. So there are lots of interesting things being discussed in this book, but just for me, the present day narrative was so much weaker than any of the previous narratives, and because that's what you spend the second half of the novel with and sort of ends the book on, for me this book ended up being one that I didn't overall really enjoy, and I wouldn't pick up another book from this author. But if you think it sounds interesting, then I'd still give it a go. Then I read the memoir A Girlhood, Letter to My Transgender Daughter by Carolyn Hayes. So the name here is a pseudonym. It just sort of says in the blurb that this author is a really successful author, but she has used a pseudonym in order to hide her family's identity. This memoir is about the fact that they were living in a sort of southern state in the US, and their child said, "I am a girl," and so they started to raise their child as a transgender girl. And then a social worker arrived on their door saying they'd been reported for neglect or abuse because of referring to their daughter as a daughter, and so they were sort of investigated. And from that moment, Carolyn Hayes sort of called everyone she could think of to call who could give guidance, and was advised by professionals that in this state that you live in, you could lose your child. This could be viewed as sort of emotional abuse, and therefore your child could be taken from you. And so because of that, they sort of move states, and as parents they start to really try and learn a lot more about what they could be doing for their daughter, and about not only what they can do within their home, but what they can do legislation wise, and also what they can do for their daughter's schooling, and just lots of different things. And so this book is written as a letter to her daughter, and I think she sort of says in the introduction that she wrote this book. Her daughter's now around 13, I think, and she wrote this book for her daughter to read, but then afterwards said, would you be okay with me publishing it, because I think it's a story that maybe needs to be heard. And her daughter obviously agreed. So I think this is definitely a book worth reading. I think, we're definitely getting more memoirs from transgender individuals, but I don't know if there's many memoirs out there from family members. And whilst I think it's more important to hear from the transgender person themselves, I also think it is an important story to hear from the perspective of parents who made the right decisions. And this author even states that at points they definitely did the wrong thing. When their daughter initially started saying, "I want you to refer to me as a girl," they sort of didn't fully take that on board. So I definitely recommend this book. I think it's a really interesting look at the early years of when somebody realises that they may be transgender, and how you, as somebody who knows that person, should react, and the information you should be aware of, and all these things. So I definitely think it's worth reading. I thought this could be a favourite read of the year for me. It wasn't, for a couple of reasons that are entirely down to writing style, and I think sort of personal preference. One is that I felt this book maybe could have been about 50 pages shorter, and it's not that long a book, but I felt like at some points maybe I felt like I was reading her feelings, and she'd already told me them 10 pages ago, and I felt like I was reading the same thing again. And I think the reason I feel like that is because most of the readers who are going to pick this book up are already going to be sort of pro-transgender people living and being happy, right? And transgender people having rights, the same rights we all have. So it's sort of preaching to the converted in a way. And so I think the repetition was there to really get the author's point across, but I don't think it was really necessary for this readership. So it's just at points it felt a bit repetitive. And then, especially bearing in mind that this book was written for her daughter, so it's a bit I don't know, I don't think you'd have needed to repeat these things to her because it is her story. And then secondly, this is entirely personal preference. This book at some points is quite lyrically written, and for me it just wasn't, it erred on the side of the type of lyrical writing I don't personally enjoy. Loads of people are going to really love the way this is written, but yeah, for me, I just at points felt I can see that this is supposed to be a really beautiful paragraph. For me, it isn't really. And so that was just personal preference, but I definitely recommend picking this one up. I think it was really interesting, and I'm glad I read it. And then lastly, I listened to A Spell of Good Things by Ayobami Adebayo on audio. So initially I picked this one up from the library and realised it had ridiculously small font. I find this really frustrating. I don't know why publishers choose to publish a book with such tiny font, and it's not even this book is super long. It could easily have just been a bit longer with bigger font. But anyway, so I took it back to the library. And I decided to listen to it on audio, and I still didn't completely love that. I 100% prefer listening to books on audio when they're in accent. I mean, I'm just rubbish at accents, so pretty much anything that isn't British, Canadian, or American, I like to read on audio because I'm not very good at sort of imagining the accent in my head. But this book has two narrators within the story, a woman and a man, and I did think that the guy that got to do the audiobook had a really low voice, and he also spoke quite softly and quietly, which definitely seems right for the character he's reading from. But I always had to switch volume between the woman narrating, because you'd turn her down and then you'd get to the guy and he'd be so quiet and softly spoken that you'd have to turn him up and also slow him down, because both my brothers have quite low voices and I often have to ask them to repeat themselves, because when someone with a really low voice talks quickly, it's sometimes hard to realise like what they're saying, and I did find that. So I would recommend the audiobook, but with those like caveats. So anyway, the actual book. The book is very different to her first book, which I think is what a lot of people are discussing when I hear them talk about it, because I think her first book, Stay With Me, was much more like readable and I guess more plot driven and sort of just easy to read, compulsive to get through. And this book is, I guess, sort of the opposite, because this book is a really slow character study that starts with these two characters who are from sort of different classes, and they're also just entirely different. So you're following this young boy who lives with his family, and his father was a teacher, and there's recently been a big shift, which means that his father has sort of lost his career and just sort of lost all form of respect, and so his family are now really struggling financially, to the point where at certain points in the novel they have to sort of beg to be able to live and to eat. And a big part of his narrative is that they send him to a school that they have to pay for, and throughout the whole book he's sort of trying to get money to pay for his schooling, because if not he gets beaten every day at school by the head teacher, which is obviously horrific. So that's sort of his story. And the other story you're following is a young woman who is in her final years of training to be a doctor. She has a really high pressure job, but she is from a very wealthy family who have sort of wealthy political connections. And she is in a relationship with a young man who is also from a wealthy family, an even wealthier family than her own, but he is violent towards her. And so you can't really see how these two narratives are going to come together. They do incredibly slowly. I think from the blurb you probably expect them to come together much quicker. They don't. So you do sort of read the book thinking, God, this is taking a while for these stories to come together. But this book is a really slow, really close examination of all the characters. And something I found interesting is that you think you're just going to get these two perspectives, but at many points throughout the novel, you'll sort of be introduced to a character, like one of their mothers, for example, and then the narrative will just spend pages telling you the mother's story. And sometimes it'll be first person, sometimes third. And you'll think afterwards, like, did I need to know all that? And I've seen a lot of reviews where people have said they feel like all of those sections could be cut. And arguably they could, because you'd still have the core of the novel. You'd still, I think, understand what the author wanted to relay about the horrible sort of class and wealth divide in Nigeria. But I think those sort of additional narratives add an awful lot of nuance and make you understand why characters are making certain decisions, which maybe feel cruel towards our main characters, but when you hear their backstory, you understand why. So I think this is a really well written book. It is not plotty, and I did find that I wasn't like super compelled to get back to the audio, so I wasn't at any points like rushing to be able to listen to it. But I do think I will continue to pick up what this author brings out next, because I think she can really write. I can picture entire scenes, the characters feel really real, incredibly detailed, and it is like, you know, pre-warning here, it is tragic. Like the way this book, the climax of this book is tragic. So sort of the irony of the title of the book being A Spell of Good Things is the complete opposite of that. And this is sort of watching some quite awful things happen. One thing I did sort of struggle with, and I found an interesting decision on the author's part, is you'd get to a point in one of the narratives where something quite like a big deal would happen, and you'd be like, God, how is Eniola or Warola going to react to that? And then the scene would cut and you'd be with a different character, and then you'd eventually get back to that person, and like a few weeks would have gone by, and you just got like a brief explanation of what had happened to end that scene. Like, for example, the first time you see that Warola's partner hits her, you're like, oh my God, like, how is she going to react? Like, what's she going to do? And it just scene cuts. You go to loads of other characters, and then you eventually come back, and like 3 weeks has passed, and you're just told like what she responded in that moment. So I sort of feel like the author gets you to a point where you're like, oh, some action has happened. What's the reaction going to be? And then just doesn't let you have the reaction. I'm not quite sure why she did that. Part of me thought to myself, was it because it's showing you the sort of the monotony of like when someone's in a relationship where there is domestic abuse and they stay, sort of showing you how normal that becomes and how these moments of what feel like awful violence and feel like a moment that should completely change the way you live don't. And so they just become like an aside, oh, that happened. And the same for Eniola, like these moments that feel awful for his family, like, well, how are they going to be able to pay this thing? Like, what are they going to do? You then, you know, a few weeks have gone by and there's another awful thing they have to deal with. So I think maybe that's what she was going for, but it does feel like she keeps snatching these scenes away from you that you really want to see unfold. So I found this a really interesting novel. I think it'd be a really good book club book because I think there's so much to discuss. And yeah, I think I should watch some like author interviews about this one because I think there's a lot that this novel has to say. And like I said, I will definitely pick up whatever she releases in the future. And so yeah, that's all the books I read in April. A real mixed bag, but definitely some great books in there, and a lot of books like that made me think a lot, which is really interesting. So yeah, if you've read these books, let me know down below. I would love to hear your thoughts on them. And also if you have any recommendations, then put those down below, like I said, for video games too. And also I'd love to know what books you read in April, and in particular, what book like made you think the most. I always think that's really interesting because I sometimes prefer doing these wrap-ups a little bit late because it gives me more time for the books to sit with me and for me to, you know, maybe a book that didn't feel as great when I finished it with 3 weeks distance really does. I think, like I said, Burnham Wood like feels even better, and I think A Spell of Good Things does as well. Like the distance, and when I'm still remembering all the detail of the story, I think, you know, speaks volumes for both of them. So yeah, those are all my thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.